Sometimes growing up is hard. And that's kind of the message that we're going to frame up today. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away childhood behind me. 1 Corinthians 13:11. Max Lucado, I think I even said that wrong. Lucado, I just learned recently it's Lucado, like avocado, if you didn't know. This is a book that Lori gave me. It's called You Can Count on God. It's a devotional book that I got a couple years ago. And as Pastor Ev and I were framing this message up together, this devotional piece stood out to me. It says, look at God. You and I were made by God to know Him and to make Him known. Children have a tendency to say, look at me on the tricycle. Look at me go. On the trampoline. Look at me bounce. On the swing set. Look at me swing. Such behavior is acceptable for children, yet many adults spend their grown-up years saying the same. Look at me drive my fancy car. Look at me make money. Look at me wear provocative clothes or use big words or flex my muscles. Look at me! Isn't it time we grew up? We were made to live a life that says, look at God. People are to look at us and not see us, but see the image of our Maker. This is God's plan, to make us into His image. This is God's promise, and He will fulfill it.
That's good.
So as we look at chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, we see everybody knows this as the love chapter. Is that really what Paul's talking about, is just love? Is there something more beyond what he's speaking into when he talks about putting childhood behind him, when he's talking about love? So that we kind of have to zoom in and look at a few of these things. And in general, Paul's teachings, whether it be to Timothy or to a church, are about instructing, about correcting behaviors, maybe some attitudes, and things of that nature. But Paul, he's not only the one that plants these churches and writes to these churches, he's also what some would call the headmaster or a shepherd to these flocks as he nurtures them along. And realistically, everything outside of Jerusalem in the faith arguably was through Paul. A lot of us are here today because of that message to the Gentiles that Paul took forward. So as we kind of look at this, let's unpack it a little.
Can you put that verse back up there for a second? So as we look at that verse, there's a number of things. If you have a Bible that you can underline, that'd be great. I do this a lot on most Sundays, but try to give you some of the Greek understandings of the different words that are a part of this. And so the word that jumps out right away, as it's printed up there, you see it 1, 2, 3, 4 times, is the word what? Child. And so starting with that, I did a little bit of research, and the Greeks had at least 3 words that are translated for us into the English as child. And they all had different meanings. I can't recall the Greek pronunciation of them all, but of those 3 that I did kind of look into, one is really offspring. So like, that is my child, or that's not my child. That's someone else's responsibility. But it represents offspring. The second has to do more so with age or how large of a human being that is. And so child ends up being something that is pointed out to say, oh, that's a child, they're only of this age or this height. This particular word here, though, that is translated as child is different from those 2 definitions. In the Greek, it's nepios, and it does mean an infant, but it's broadened, and it goes into the idea of maturation. This is a person who is simple-minded or immature or unenlightened is another word that was given here, unlearned. We might say naive. So this word, nepios, is used 15 times in the New Testament, including these 4 times. And it's all in Paul's writings, except for in the Gospels, there is a statement that Jesus makes in 3 different Gospels. This is the quote from Matthew 11:25. It says, "At this time Jesus said, 'I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children,'" revealed them to immature, unlearned individuals. A couple other words very quickly here that jumped out at me, where it says, "When I was a child, I talked like a child." The first one there, laleo, to talk, but more so to use words to declare your mind and your thoughts, your perspective about something. And that takes us to the next one. I thought like a child, phroneo, to have an opinion. But it's interesting, this opinion that you have here, or I thought, I had an opinion, it is in respect to yourself, how I view myself. And then reason, logizomai, to reckon or count or compute, calculate. Then we kind of get to the swing part here of this verse. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. The phrase that we have there, put behind me, is one word in the Greek, to put behind, katargeo. And instead of, so in my head when I read that, I put it behind me, it doesn't necessarily mean devaluing it in the English. I just kind of set that aside. But when you look at it in the Greek, it says this, to render something inert so that it will have no effect. It will be done away with. It will cause to cease. It will be abolished from my life. That's really significant. When I put something behind me, sometimes it's like it's only there so it's not in my in front of me, but it's still there in my periphery so I can grab it if I need it. What Paul is saying is, no, that is gone. It's not going to shape who I am ever again. And then the word became, ginomai, means to come into being. For want of a better word, it might be evolve. I transition into a different way of looking at things, a change of condition. And then the word here too, it says, when I became a man, and the word there is aner. And it is with a reference to age, to distinguish an adult man from a boy. And it also added kind of, one of the phrases that I thought was interesting there was to become a gentleman, which we don't see again in the English. Jeff, go ahead.
So we have to ask ourselves, what is it that Paul is trying to say here? What does he mean by putting childhood behind himself? So we actually pull back and look at the 1 Corinthian letter as a whole. Paul is talking about division within the church and the need for unity, the promiscuity and the need for integrity of the goers of the temple, talking about food and general gathering and the church needing to plug in to the power to love others. So we kind of zoom back in down onto chapter 12, and Paul has just gone through going over some of the spiritual gifts, prophecy, speaking in tongues, and so on and so forth. And this takes us back to the beginning of the chapter, that if we do these things without love, we are a clanging gong. We are a nothing, just making noise, really. And the importance, though, as he instructs, is that these gifts are in part. They're partially known. They're from a childlike mindset that we don't fully understand everything we think we do. And so what he's asking for is this moment of maturity, this moment of taking these concepts and these ideas that we hold to and think this is the way it ought to be, and the reality is it's the way God wants it to be. It's not the way we want it to be. It's a great thing to speak in tongues, sure. I know we don't celebrate that necessarily in the Nazarene church, but if there's a translator, it's appropriate. Scripture tells us this. But Paul says it's even better to prophesy, because then we edify the church. And that's what we're trying to do today, is to bring edification to you folks, to bring the knowledge of what it is that Paul's talking about. And really, as we frame up what he's talking about, more so is putting every aspect of our lives through the lens of the gospel. That's what he's talking about when he talks about love. He's talking about agape. He's talking about servitude. He's talking about these things are great things, but if they're not done in servitude to each other, then what's the point, right? So I think that's the most important thing we can do, is to understand that when Paul says to set these things aside, he's asking us to step into a place of spiritual maturity, to come to a place of thinking of ourselves less.
So I know it's kind of an unwelcome word in the church, and I understand why. But the word you kind of begin to see shape here, I said evolve, but even evolution of who we are. Everybody's okay. Nobody fainted. But evolution in the sense like connected with this maturity process. So about half of you, at one point or another, were a part of the On the Road series that we had for men. If you were here for at least one of those things, raise your hand. Okay. So most of the guys here. In that series, during that, I wrote down here, Journey Together, in addition to having some great food that was provided each time, and looking at some very hot cars, we studied a 6-part series that I think it's Robert Hicks. I don't have that written down here, but the writer of the book that we were kind of working our way through noted this same kind of challenge, and it's been very interesting to me. I've been in a lot of conversations recently with people about generational thinking. Anybody else? Talking with other folks about, okay, a few of you. But just, there's things, and I was just in a marriage pre-wedding kind of counsel moment here just before we started the service, and just talking about the things that shape us and our thinking and how we view stuff. And generational thinking is one of those things. What Paul is getting into here, and this idea about maturity, I'm going to run through some things very quickly. The writer said that there are at least 6 different words that are used, Old Testament, New Testament, for the word man, as we're translating it. I'm not going to give you all those words, but the 6 stages that he talks, or that we went through together. Number 1 was Adam, which he gives the phrase or attachment to, or the tagline, the noble savage. Does any of you guys remember that? Adam, the noble savage. The word Adam actually comes, the Hebrew word Adamu or Adamatu. It just means red or brown dirt or blood. Literal translation. And so Adam represented, in fact, more than man, just kind of mankind. And then he walks us through, and I'll just go through these very quickly. Stage 2, again, there was a Hebrew word for this, but the phrase that was attached to it was man as a reproducer. A man who is aware that he can create folks who will inherit from him. And that becomes a focus. And the Bible character representing that was Samson. The problem with that stage is that some men never leave that stage. That becomes the primary thought on their lives, through their lives, unfortunately. And that is as far as they mature. And if you remember the story of Samson, that's an illustration of, even though he desires to do right, his preoccupation blends into his temptations, and that limits the spiritual growth of his life. The 3rd stage is man as the glorious warrior. The Bible character that's used to illustrate that is King David. And David, who has had great successes but also has struggles, he kind of gets past, for the most part, stage 2. But when he is not at war, and you remember how that story begins, when kings were supposed to be about doing war, David was not there. And so outside of his understanding of being this warrior hero person, he struggles to find meaning, at least at those moments, and he gets caught up in some other things with Bathsheba that we don't need to go into. But one of the questions that we dealt with at that point, because if I asked how many men here were, in this place of glorious warrior, how many men would be willing to die for their family? Most every man would raise their hand. But if I said, how do you live for your family? A lot of men would go, well, can I take another class or something? We don't completely understand that idea, and so that's something we need to work on. Stage 4 is the wounded man, and the Bible character that is used to represent that is Jacob, the wounded man, who after wrestling with God and winning, but he still comes away with need of hip replacement surgery. And they didn't have that then, at least that we're aware of. But there's something that happens in that moment, or at the tail end of that story, is he begins to understand that pain in his life has a purpose. And he grows through it, through this conversation he has with God. And so we're evolving a little bit further. Stage 5 then is the grown-up man, and the Bible character used to reference that is Elijah, who grows up, experiences victory and discouragement, but through conversation with God begins to understand even more about his journey and eventually determines that the next step in the grown-up man understanding of life is to mentor a younger man. And so he works his way also through some difficulties, but ends up in a place that is very positive, not just for him, but he's passing on. And then stage 6 is the fulfilled man, represented by Moses. And he's known as the sage, or in Swahili, the mzee, yeah? Anybody the mzee, yes? Say ndio or something. Ndio, that means yes. But the sage or the mzee, somebody who you can go to for advice. It's interesting too, and I'll just read this last part and turn things back over to Jeff here. But he has worked through loss, personal regret. Remember, he was once in line to be the leader of Egypt. Then he commits murder. He becomes a wanderer, a shepherd for someone else's sheep. And then he rises again to lead another nation. He also begins to mentor someone, Joshua. And at the end of it all, which I think this is absolutely amazing, and it speaks to this evolution, these 6 stages, he does not get to go into the promised land, but he's still at peace. A fulfilled life with meaning and purpose throughout. Oh, one of the things I wanted to say, just as we wrap that up too, is that ties us all the way back to the very tail end of that verse. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. So I thought it'd be good for us to transition here instead of just Jeff shares, I share, we go that way. Some of I think it's Father's Day, so some of this process relates to our relationship with our fathers, and what we get handed down. So Jeff, how was your relationship with your dad?
Like oil and water. Growing up, my dad and I were very different. He loved singing in the choir. I loved singing in a metal band. He hated spicy food. I love spicy food. We didn't see eye to eye a lot. Most of my adolescence, he and I were at odds. And we'll go into it more as we move on. But
very different personalities.
Very different personalities.
Yeah.
Very different. He was a speech and drama teacher, and if you knew what's going on inside my head right now, you'd know I'm terrified up here. So the reality is that we just didn't see eye to eye. And a young man, at one point, I thought I knew better than my father.
So there was a statement when I was I think, adolescence and into college, and the statement that was kind of out in the world, it was this: don't trust anyone, what? Finish for me.
Over 40, over 30?
Over the age of 30, yeah. And that just speaks to you about some of the generational dissonance that can come between a son and a father. And since we're in this space kind of learning about what this verse means and what Paul was trying to say, but I felt like it was also good for us to talk a little bit. I've shared a bunch about my own relationship with my dad and he's been gone 13 years now, but very similar, I think, to Jeff. I was not the front man in a scream rock band, but we were very different in our approaches to life. My dad was very much a natural science guy, 32 years a Boeing engineer, and just that was his track. And I tried to stay as far away from natural sciences as I could. I never said that to myself. That's just where I always ended up. And so we clashed with a lot of things, even into being saved. We just had different ways. I was much more a social science kind of person. But one illustration I thought fits, it connects both of these together just very quickly, is that my dad, as I said, was an engineer, and this is before I was a Christian. I must have been, because I got saved around 19, so I was probably around 15 or 16. And my dad, I would see disappear into his den oftentimes when he was home. And he had a drafting board set up there, and he would work on there. Sometimes he did side jobs and stuff like that, and helping design different things for Boeing and for other people there at the house in his den. And there was this one day that he grabbed me, and I say grabbed, it wasn't like, yeah, come here. It was just, hey, come here, I want to show you something. And he walked me into the den, and he says, I want to show you how all this works. And some of you who have done drafting, with some of that equipment, it's very different today because it's all digitized. So you don't use that big board anymore. But he was showing me how that worked, and he had this really cool thing full of pencils that I did steal from time to time that you would open up. But it had the leads that went in there, so you could do all the writing and the drawing, and it was it was so precise. And he's showing me all this, and I looked at him, and I'm watching what he's doing, but I'm antsy. I wanted to go play baseball or do something outside the house, and he's looking at me, and I'm like, why are you showing me? Why are you showing me all this? And this is a true story, and I regret this whole last part of it. But he said, because maybe someday you'll want to do this, and I can show you how, and then you could also come to work at Boeing. And I said, Dad, I want to do something important with my life. I did not remember that story at all until much later in life. In fact, it was after we were both Christians, and he told me about that story, and I felt so terrible. And the verse that came to my mind was, I really didn't understand what it meant to grow up. And so I connect that verse with that story almost every time I think about it.
As Pastor Evan and I kept sharing and going back and forth about what we're going to share today, and that story sparked one that I don't remember either, but my dad let me be aware of this moment. I don't remember the full context of everything, but we were having a discussion, and basically he was lamenting getting older. And he said, when I get older, just send me out to pasture. And in my arrogance of youth, I said, do we have to wait? Yeah, right? Trust me. The word bare-bottom spanking was very familiar to my vocabulary as a kid. But in returning to Christ in my adult years is where I said earlier that we were an oil and water situation. If you understand the way cooking works and things of that nature, there's such a thing as an emulsification, where these two bonds can now come together. And it's through an outside force. And that was God. I thank God that he brought me back to a place where my dad and I we're able to reconcile, to a place where I apologize for being a punk kid.
Yay for apologies.
Woo! So, it was a good thing. And he and I were sharing music, and he and I were sharing thoughts, and I was bouncing early essays and stuff like that off of him. He, being an English teacher, is a great resource to lean in on that. I miss him. He's been gone 2 years now. And I don't have that ability to bounce those things off him. God's put great men in my path to be able to do that with, and I'm so thankful for that. So if you're out there and you're a dad, and maybe you have an estranged son, keep praying. God hears us and it works. If you're a kid out there and you have an estrangement with your dad, this is that moment we're talking about what Paul's instructing for maturity, for growing up, for putting childish things behind us. When I was a child, I thought as a child. I talked as a child. But now that I'm a man, I've put childhood things behind me. And in searching through this moment, the fruit of the Spirit, the very last one hits me every time. It's called self-control. I've had to learn to submit myself to an authority that was above me before I ever even knew it. Thank God God's God, and he's compassionate and loving and caring, and that authority doesn't mean some sort of a militant dictator, but the opportunity to align our thoughts, our every moment, our every being through that scope of the gospel that I was talking about earlier. That's what Paul's telling everybody every time. When you read every one of his epistles, he's constantly calling back to here's the issue, here's how to solve it. And it's always pointed back to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so in thinking about that submission, thinking about that place of self-control, as we were studying and going back and forth, this verse stood out to me. It's Psalm 131, 1 and 2. Lord, my heart is not proud. My eyes are not haughty. I don't concern myself with matters too great or too awesome to be my grasp. Instead, I have calmed and quieted myself. Like a weaned child no longer cries for its mother. Yes, like a weaned child, my soul within me. As we lean back into worship with the band, if there are three guys...
Actually, I have somebody who's already set to do that at the end.
Pastor Ev has somebody, you know who you are. We'd like you to come up and pray for us. But I think the culminating message today is that we don't understand what we think we understand. And that the realities of who we are as adults and who we are as children of God all comes down to that the gospel view that we as Christians are to be known by him and make him known, as Leonce said earlier when I read, that if you don't know Jesus, if you're online, or you're sitting here right now, and maybe this is the first time you've ever been here, that submission I talked about a minute ago, man, it's so good. Lord's done things in my life I never thought would be realistic. I gave Rhonda an awkward smile earlier, and she liked it, and I said, that's my I don't belong here smile. And she said, you belong here. And when I say that, I meant where God's brought me. I don't deserve it. I don't belong up here, in my opinion, half the time. But that's not the call that God asked me to be timid. That's not the spirit he gives us. And so I've said yes. I said, okay, what does it mean to step into ministry? And what does it mean to be able to stand up here and confess with a whole heart that if we don't have Jesus, we have nothing. If we don't have love, we are a noisy gong. I ask you today, if you have not submitted yourself to Christ, or if you need to resubmit yourself to Christ, please, the altars are open.
Amen. Let's stand together.